All right. Yeah, I'm really happy to be sitting down with Laura Burwick. Laura is the director of Hope Recovery, which is an addiction support environment community group up here in Shasta County, Redding, California. And we're doing a deep dive talking about addiction and how addiction is something that is something in our community, in our culture. Like it is happening, it's going on. We want to be aware of it. And as a church, we want to be the church. We want to be aware to the degree that we can get in there, mix it up, be a part of the solution space, be supportive. Yeah, we don't want to be ignorant and on the sidelines, right? As Jesus people. How are you, Laura? It's so good to see you.
I'm good. I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on. It's one of my favorite things to talk about.
Come on. No, I'm like, we're honored to have you. Thanks for being willing to give us some of your day. And let's get right into it. Why don't we start with your background, your history in addiction, like how you came to be doing the stuff you're doing. Then we'll get into more of the details of what you're doing.
Sure.
But your background with addiction.
Sure. Well, back in the day, pre-Jesus,
Yes.
was 19, got pregnant, got married, didn't realize I was marrying an alcoholic. And so 4 or 5 years into our marriage, he went to treatment, and I was so insecure. And as a family member, his addiction has affected so much of our family. And so then he goes and gets well, and I think he's going to come home and our family's going to be fixed and everything's going to be wonderful. Well, he came home and then he was saying, well, I have to go to meetings every night and I have to go do this. And I had no grid for the whole family needed to heal.
Wow.
And so I would just get angry and I would do things to shoot him in the foot because I wanted to be seen and heard.
Yeah.
And I didn't realize I needed to heal as much as he needed to heal.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going to school and becoming a drug and alcohol counselor because I thought then I could fix what was happening in my family.
Wow.
And then, it just turned into this lifelong career. So I've worked at the treatment centers that are, probably $40,000 for 30 days of treatment now. I started out working with teenagers in a locked facility with doctors and nurses. I worked as part of a team with a therapist. I've worked at a community college, just in like a social milieu type setting, helping people coming back to school who didn't go to college straight from high school, who, mostly were women in abusive relationships or struggling with addiction themselves, just to help them learn life skills so that they could effectively, support their kids. And then, I've just worked a little bit all over the place with addiction.
How many years have you been in this space? It sounds like many different settings, doing all kinds of things from group stuff to individual counseling to treatment centers. How long have you been in that world?
I started in 1986. So I think it's over 30 years now. I think I'm getting close to 35 years now.
Yeah, definitely have some knowledge, definitely expert status there.
Yeah.
What did you learn? And I don't want to make this the large focus of our conversation, but what did you learn about what family members need in that addiction recovery space? So, as a wife, you're like, man, I've got my needs, and sounds like you're really negatively impacting the marriage to try to get those needs met. Now, what have you discovered there?
Well, I learned that I needed treatment as much as he did, that,
Wow.
he had become my drug, and me trying to fix things in our family
Wow.
had so impacted me in the way that I raised my kids and the places that I put my kids and where I took my kids. And so I learned that I think the most impactful thing I learned was that I had to get well, and I had to learn how to manage my own self and stop worrying about managing him.
Yep. Wow. That's a big thought. You needed therapy just as much as the family member that was in recovery or
Absolutely.
suffering with addiction. I've never heard that, and that makes a ton of sense. But
Yeah.
so tell me, all those years, let's unpack addiction a little bit. What is addiction? You're working in the space in so many different settings. How would you, what are the roots to addiction? What does getting free from addiction look like? I know we could spend hours there.
Yeah. Well, I think having been raised professionally and personally, like in 12-step programs, and then coming into the church and a supernatural environment,
Okay.
that it's important that we realize everybody wants to find that one thing that's going to define addiction and help people get well, because it's such a hard thing to manage.
Wow.
And so I think it's important that we realize that it is spirit, soul, and body.
Okay.
It affects all three of our spirit, soul, and body. And we can't just look at trauma. We can't just look at is alcoholism is a disease. Like, we know that, the enemy out there wants to take people out. I mean, when you think about some of our biggest evangelists that are out in our world right now, they come from addiction backgrounds.
Wow.
Right? They are such powerful people. And I truly believe people that suffer with the affliction of addiction are really powerful people. And of course, the enemy wants to take them out, and people can't. I mean, if it just required removing the drugs or alcohol or the process out of someone's life, then I wouldn't have a job.
Yeah.
If it just meant taking the drugs away or
Sure.
not having a casino, that there is those things inside our soul that need to heal. Like, we need to heal from the trauma. We need to learn how to live life and face life on life's terms, as they would say in 12-step. And then there's the physical part of it, and you see it all the time. Addiction runs in families.
Okay.
Right? Like, if there's addiction in your family history, then you have a predisposition to, if you start drinking, that there's a good chance you might become an alcoholic. And I think in the church, we forget that science shows us that there's even markers in DNA that show whether you are susceptible to addiction or not, just like diabetes or different kinds of cancers. So, no little girl or boy wakes up in the morning and says, hey, you know what, when I grow up, I want to destroy my life and everybody I love around me. Like, it's just not anybody's goal. And so I think if we can recognize that, not everybody who experiences trauma has addiction, and that it's not a choice. Like, for my body physically to be made up, that if I do this process or ingest these drugs, I'm going to be an addict. Like, it's not a choice.
Wow.
And that, it's really hard for people because, well, the truth is, like, we have a choice to get treatment. I mean, that's where the choice comes in. I can choose to get well or not.
Yeah.
But the fact that I have addiction is my affliction isn't a choice.
Wow.
And that's really hard because, when it comes to addiction as a disease, there's so much emotional damage that happens around you and almost everybody's been affected by addiction in some way. And so everybody has an emotional response to it. And so it can be really hard. But, if you take away that shame of, there must just be something morally wrong with me, and that's why I suffer from addiction. Like, if we can take some of the shame and guilt and mystery out of addiction, I think that as a church, it would be easier to have compassion for people and be able to move towards, having more of an open dialogue and take away some of the shame and those things that go around.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's kind of sad that a 12-step program that replaces an addiction with a dependency on the program, that will let you have a doorknob as your higher power, if that's what you want, does a better job of making people feel loved than we do in the church. Like, we should be the ones that are in the forerunner of helping people feel loved.
Totally. So let's go there. Let's talk about what you've seen with healing. So you mentioned it's like, hey, there's no simple answer as to why people suffer from addiction. There's a lot going on, spirit, soul, body. In many cases, it's not even a choice. It's like there's like this predisposition towards it. So
Right.
a lot to deal with there. What have you experienced over the years in terms of the healing cycles that people enter into? And again, I would assume there's nuance. People are healing in different ways. But you mentioned right there the shame dynamic. So being able to have open dialogue is a piece of the puzzle. Well, I don't know. Do you want to share stories or other elements of what the healing process has looked like for people?
Well, it runs the whole gamut. I met a youth pastor one time, and his story was he went into like a recovery home, was using an unreasonable amount of heroin every day,
Okay.
fell on his knees and said, Lord, if you will heal me, I will serve you. And
Wow.
he went to sleep, woke up the next morning, didn't experience any withdrawals, was completely delivered,
Wow.
and went on and lived. Is probably still a youth pastor. I've lost track of him. That
Yeah.
was years ago. And then there was a woman in our church whose brother had burned one of the local dealers. And so she got heroin that had rat poison in it.
Mm.
And she did the rat poison, and they took her to the hospital. The hospital pronounced her dead. They had toe tagged her, covered her up. We're waiting for her family to come from home to identify her. And while she was laying there, her experience was she felt like she was in this tunnel going down, and it just kept getting blacker and blacker and blacker. And all she could hear is, "Where's your God now? It's a lie. Anything he ever said to you was a lie. You're dying and going to hell." And she said all she could do was think the name Jesus, like whatever consciousness you are when that's happening, and your body's laying dead in a hospital.
Yeah.
And she thought the word Jesus, and everything started to slow down a little bit. So she said she just kept thinking it louder, and then she could see herself saying it out loud, and she stopped going down. She came back up into the light, right? As her family walks in to identify her, she sits up, is resurrected, alive and well today, right? And after having that experience, she still didn't get clean.
Wow.
It was still a process for her to learn what life would look like without what she had known her whole life to be the way she lived and managed her life and dealt with problems.
Yeah.
So being in community is so important. Like, you have to have a community around you. Accountability is really important when it comes to helping people with addiction. Some of the models that have shown the most success is that there's a 2-year span of treatment, that you start out in a residential setting, and then it titrates down. You go into sober living. And so sometimes people just have to have the external boundaries to help them
Yeah.
until their internal boundaries can manage life in a different way.
Yeah.
And that's true even in our relationship with Jesus. It's not, I didn't wake up one morning and completely trust him with every area of my life. I think he enjoys the journey with us.
Yeah.
Otherwise, why would we be born as babies, if he didn't want us to learn and grow and have life be a journey? So when I went to school, the science that they showed you was they put a rat in a cage with one bottle of water and one with cocaine in it and one without, and the rat would take the cocaine one every single time until it was full-blown addiction. Now they've done a study, and they put a rat in a community with everything they need, like the utopia for rats, and they give them those 2 bottles of water, and more often than not, they choose the one without cocaine.
Yeah.
So it is important to recognize that, like, we really need a community. Like, people need to be able to talk about how they feel.
Yeah.
I mean, in 12-step, they understand that if I can't show up and authentically be myself and not be okay, like, sometimes it's a difference between life and death.
Yeah.
And so it's been my experience that people who have good supportive family around them, good accountability, but sometimes, it takes 3 or 4 times for people to finally get it, for people to learn how to let community, to learn how to love, to learn how to manage their emotions, to learn how to trust the Lord, trust that people are going to show up for them. get some of that inner healing done, that it's just a process.
Yeah. Yeah. When you made a statement earlier, like this gal that had this kind of near death experience, and then she comes back, and there wasn't that immediate freedom. And you said the phrase, like, she had lived for so long and learned how to manage her problems. Talk
Yeah,
about that. So like an addict, like there is an escape hatch, right? Into the substance, whatever the addiction is, there's some kind of like fantasy sort of infrastructure that's being grown in a person's soul, in a person's psyche.
sure.
They're avoiding maybe pressure, pain, tough relationships, maybe responsibilities that feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
Um, and then now you're talking about, okay, but in community, that that infrastructure can be redesigned. What do you see in the community that starts to kind of like chop at that edifice, break down the fantasy world and create a real world? Um,
Well, you have people that will speak life into you, for one,
yeah,
and the addiction affects that part of your brain called the pleasure pathway. And so sometimes, your body just physically gets triggered, which
yeah,
is one of the reasons why it's hard, so that's that whole, if I have external um, boundaries in place, when my brain goes, oh, remember that one thing, we have to have that or we're going to die. There's a situation coming up. It's going to be really painful. I don't know how to deal with it. Oh yeah. Remember that one thing we used to do? We can do that. And so your brain actually can trigger a response. It's that compulsive obsessive thing that people experience.
yeah,
But if I have some accountability around me in that moment, when I go, wait a minute, like I really have to have this. Oh, but you know what? I'm going to talk to Laura on Thursday and she's going to ask me how I did. And I don't want to have to say I slipped up.
ah,
Sometimes that outside accountability can be so important. And that's why community is so important, because if I only know how to live my life a certain way and I don't have any other tools, and I
yeah,
don't know that Jesus is going to show up for me,
yeah,
I'm gonna lean on my own understanding again. So
yeah,
it's just that process of, letting people love you, learning how to sit for a minute instead of impulsively going and doing something. Part of the characteristics for people who are affected with addiction are that they're risk takers and they love to take chances. And, I worked with a woman early in treatment, and back in the day, like 80s, she was in the military and she used to literally run guns and drugs on military planes. Like she was a radical,
yeah,
She's a great businesswoman now and has 35 years of sobriety. People will say addicts don't have any self-will. Well, that's not true.
yeah,
If an addict gets something on their mind and they want to go get it, they're going to be able to go find it. It's just, making it have meaning, given meaning, and but like pointing them, like getting them going in the right direction so that they can live their life fully.
yeah. Yeah, I mean that sounds pretty intriguing right there. Like this desire for a high, like we want to live full tilt.
Yeah.
We don't want to just kind of like cruise or status quo. And so maybe getting free includes finding some vision or finding something
Yeah.
worth running after. And that's interesting. I love that.
Yeah.
So what about now? Let's talk a little bit about you. You run a like a recovery support group here in our community, Hope Recovery. Um, you've mentioned a lot. You talked a lot about community, and is there anything else that you want to just bring up or draw out from the Hope Recovery side of your journey?
Sure.
Uh,
Well, when Hope Recovery, the thought about Hope Recovery was to provide a supernatural recover community for people who love Jesus.
Okay.
And at Hope Recovery, it's it's commonly said that once you're an alcoholic or an addict, you're always an alcoholic or an addict.
Okay.
And actually, it's your affliction, it's not your identity.
Okay.
And so that's the big difference for Hope. Like, I love AA, I love Al-Anon, I love Celebrate Recovery.
Yeah.
There's so many people that are functioning and living life and not hurting themselves and others. There's so much value in what they offer. I just, in this community, in knowing Jesus, just don't think that it's your identity. And so
Yeah.
that's,
I love that.
and at Hope Recovery, everybody stays in the same room.
Okay.
When I started going to treatment, when I started going to meetings myself, when my husband got well, we never did anything together. And that
Oh,
was part of my fear was, he was going and meeting all these people that were separate from me. And I was
um,
already insecure and,
mm,
afraid he was going to leave me if he got well anyway, and so and I think we protect sometimes people who suffer from addiction too much from the consequences because we're so afraid they're going to go back out and use. But I think it's helpful to have people sit in the room together and,
yeah.
have the people who had, like maybe have lost their kids to the system or, they they lost everything for their family. To hear a young woman get up and tell their story about, I grew up with my mom being an alcoholic, and this is what it looked like, and this is what it felt like, and this is how it has affected me. And so here I am, like, here's my story, the consequences of what you've done your whole life. Or for family members to get to hear other people talk about how no matter what they tried, no matter how much they loved their family, they
Mm,
just would choose to drink every day or do drugs. And so I think that if we're going to heal, it needs to be as a family with everybody in the same room so that there's a level of compassion and understanding being together, and that we don't identify as alcoholics or addicts because it's not your identity, it's your affliction. And also we celebrate, we celebrate with little keys to the kingdom, like here's the key to your freedom.
mm,
And we have little pendants with trees on it to honor family members. Like, nobody ever said, Laura, great job for like standing by John
mm.
for 5 years in recovery and for recovering yourself and doing what it takes. So we like to celebrate families and like just celebrate it all.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I read a stat. I think stats are pretty fluid, and I mean, you can read a stat and maybe the next day it doesn't apply. But I read a stat that substance abuse is the third largest cause of death in our nation, and that was a really shocking stat to me. Um, in your journey, I mean, what would you say to somebody? And I know there's a recent story of somebody we're both close to that passed away in his addiction. And what would you say to somebody that might be like teetering on that edge? Like I think a lot of that is potentially accidental versus on purpose.
Sure.
Like that, thus the term overdose. It's like, was it on purpose? Was it accidental? But I just think, like, I know the Lord's heart goes out to anyone that's in that space. Like, what would you say? Um, would you just reiterate what you've already been saying, which is like, hey, we want to support you. We want to embrace you. Come process with us. You don't need to be alone. Or
Yeah.
no.
I mean, that's the hardest part, isn't it? The families and individuals that I've worked with have such a deep sense of feeling and compassion. And I think that's part of the challenge is, the emotions are so intense. So
Yeah.
that, emotions pass, feelings aren't facts. They don't always make sense. Like, you can't
Um,
live your life from those emotions.
uh,
And, especially when people first come to get well, whether it's me, the supportive spouse, or the person with the addiction, it's like, an M&M, you've candy coated things with the way that you deal with life so much that when you take that candy coating away, everything feels really hard and really intense and really big. I equate it to road rash, when you fall off your bike and you skin your knee and there's little rocks everywhere. Like that's how your emotions feel when you first start to embark on a journey to get healthy, but it doesn't always stay that way. Like it gets better,
It's good.
and the thing that we say often with suicide is like, it's a permanent solution to a temporary problem,
Wow.
and when you think about the loved ones with like, I don't think I could ever do it because I couldn't imagine the look on the people that love me. I couldn't
Mhm.
imagine what it would do to them. Like
Mhm.
I would rather stay alive and learn how to manage my pain than create such an intense amount of pain to people I love. So,
Yeah.
like think it through. That's one of the things that people with addiction have a hard time like thinking it through, looking for always the instant fix in the moment and not following that thought all the way through to the end.
Yeah.
So follow that thought all the way through to the end.
Yeah. And what would you want the church to know in everything we're talking about?
How hard it is to show up and be who you are in an environment that you already feel less than already.
Okay.
Like if you like coming into the church and having a past, like I have a past, I was a drug dealer, all these things. And then you come around people that have been in the church and it feels like they've done it right their whole life. There's always a sense of, I'll never measure up to that. Or, even questions like why, when I was a teenager and I accepted the Lord, didn't he get a hold of me in a way that changed my life forever? You know what I mean? Like, so it can create questions about how much God loves you versus other people. And, then there's just things like when you get to know someone and you've started a new life, you don't necessarily want to let them know everything about your past.
Mm.
But at the same time, if we can't show up and authentically be ourselves, then it's like we're showing up and putting our smile on for Sunday and then living our life the other 6 days of the week,
Yeah.
and so it's just so important to like not be afraid to ask questions, not be afraid to want to understand, to really, like we do any other part of our life or journey as Christians, like what are the things, what are my biases? Like what are the areas, what are the thoughts or beliefs I have, Jesus, that don't come into alignment with the kingdom when I look at someone who has struggled with addiction, or I see the homeless person on the street. I would challenge the church that, there's a ton of people sitting inside your church in the pews that are bleeding right now and don't know how to come ask for help because they're afraid of judgment or, you know, just their own insecurities of fear of rejection.
Yeah.
And to just, be sensitive to the people around you. Be careful, what you say. We've learned that in this pandemic with vaccination, not vaccination, and people will go, oh, it's just a flu. And you're standing next to a person who's lost somebody to it, to be sensitive and think about what we say, because we don't know what the people around us, what their experience is, and so to just be mindful and have compassion when you see people sitting around you,
It's
but
good.
not be afraid of the conversation.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned it's like Al-Anon and AA. They say, hey, you can come as you are.
Yeah.
And so, how true is that in whatever normal culture? Probably not super true. Like most of culture, there's a lot of performance dynamics, a lot of transactional dynamics in whatever we're doing, whether it's showing up to work, even important relationships, very transactional. Like
Yeah.
you give, you get. It's like I did this, you do, you scratch my back.
Yeah.
So is the church a setting where you can freely be yourself, or if you share your darkness or the things you're struggling with, now you're labeled. You've got a scarlet letter hanging on you. That's a that feels like something we could definitely steward as the church. No, like we rely on the grace of God. We understand that by the grace of God, there go I, and everybody's journey is unique. I still think it's a problem in the church. I mean, I know of people very close to me. They're like, no, I don't share that side of my story with people because I've been labeled. You know,
Yeah.
if I say what I actually used to deal with, I'll end up labeled in that setting, which I'm like, oh, that's so tragic,
It is, isn't
because
it?
you're actually like giving away a part of who you are, your life or your story. Or so I love that. It's like, be compassionate, be empathetic, be careful, be mindful.
Yeah.
I think also, I wonder if people feel a sense of like powerlessness, like, oh, I don't even know how to handle that level of someone's pain. What would you say to that individual that's maybe they're in a really pure-hearted place? They definitely have compassion and empathy. They're not judging, but there is a dynamic of like, oh my God, what would I do if somebody was just bleeding on me like that?
Because they're still struggling with addiction, or they're just part of the
Well,
community.
like an individual that is in a different place, they're not dealing with addiction, and then they bump into somebody that's like, yeah, I'm suffering with addiction, and man, it's hard. And they're like, so that individual is listening and they care, but they're like, I feel powerless. I don't know what to do. How can I be of help? You know?
Yeah, it's so important just to ask questions and just to listen,
Okay.
and if you don't know what to do, or you don't know how to lead them next,
Yeah,
then you say, hey, let's figure out together what you can do next. I mean, there's so many resources even here,
sure.
in Shasta County. I mean, you can always dial 211. It's
Okay.
this amazing thing. Like, you dial 211 and there's somebody on the other end that can tell you all the social services that are available in your county.
Wow.
And that's true for any county you're in,
Okay.
and so if you don't have any experience at all, you can always go, let's call 211.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of, there's the 1-800 addiction hotlines that you can call that will give you really good information. And, I would say, more than anything, that you would say to that person, okay, and call me tomorrow to let me know what you're doing about it. So, like, you don't
Mm,
have to get involved in their treatment. You know, you especially don't want to do it for them. You don't want to give them money. Like, you want to be careful. You don't want to help them in a way that's going to enable them to go
okay.
more unhealthy,
Yeah.
um, but you know, that you go, okay, call me tomorrow. And then in that 24 hours, reach out to anybody that knows anything about it, and go, hey, what do you recommend I do or say? But so often people
Great.
just want to be heard,
Yeah.
you know, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention at this time that people who suffer with addiction can be very manipulative to get out of you what they want. And anytime you feel it, like, boundaries, 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 boundaries are important in all areas of life, no matter what your affliction is or where you come from.
Yeah.
And if you're not sure of something, that you go, you know what, let me think about that and I'll get back to you. Like,
Yeah.
don't be pressured into doing something that makes you feel uncomfortable, because, love, we talk a lot about love looks like something, and sometimes love looks like saying no,
Okay.
you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's like a double-edged sword there, because we were saying at the onset, like, man, maybe the church doesn't do a good job of acceptance and compassion. And yet maybe the church does do a good job, but then somebody who's suffering tells them they're not doing a good job, the manipulation dynamic. So
Right.
I love what you're describing. Like, it's the total package. Hey, you can empathize, you can listen, you don't have to have all the answers. It's okay for you to have boundaries as you're open to
Yeah.
somebody who's in a journey of healing or recovery. Um, I think those of us that are like, maybe lean more towards empathy, compassion, we would potentially feel like, oh God, I feel bad if I'm not giving them money, or I feel bad if I'm not really doing a bunch that directly helps them
Yeah.
besides just listening. So I think that's an empowering statement you're making. Like,
Yeah.
you don't have to fix them. You don't even have to like be in their journey of healing. You just listen and ask questions and be available. Check in with them. Tell them to give you a call. I like that. That's really practical.
Yeah. Point them in the right direction, because you can tell pretty quickly if somebody's trying to work you to get something out of you, or if they really are in a place where they want help.
Okay.
Because one of the things that they teach you is, you don't want to necessarily do something for them that they could do for themselves,
Yeah.
like maybe, like most treatment centers won't even talk to you to help get someone into treatment. They want to talk to the person because there's so many well-meaning family members that will take up 10 hours of your time trying to get their family member in who's never even said they wanted treatment,
Wow.
you know? And so some of it is walking alongside them like we would in any other discipleship model, like
Yeah.
walking alongside them and letting them make their own choices.
It's good.
Yeah.
I love that. And anything as we're kind of landing this conversation, anything that I haven't led you towards that you want to communicate, or any parting thoughts, last words?
Yeah. I would say, just based on my own recent past experience, that you can turn your life around with the Lord and you can be sold out for the Lord. And then sometimes the choices that you made in your past, they pop back up in your life, like maybe the parent who is saved and their kids aren't saved, and or even the parents who raise their kids in the church and then, their son or daughter starts to suffer with addiction and, because of fear of what people are going to think, you don't reach out. Like, find your tribe, find those people in church that are your community. Like, you don't have to get up on the pulpit and share your whole life story, but at least start with 2 or 3 people and give them some information about who you are, and give them the opportunity to show up for you in the church as well, and that we are open to. I mean, it's really hard when you've been around for a while and you feel like you should be better or life shouldn't be hard, that we just pay attention to the people around us and let people not be okay. Like,
Yeah.
we're so quick to fix pain. That's part of the problem with addiction, is like, it's so hard. Like you said, it's so hard to sit. One of my best friends just lost her daughter, and it's so hard to sit in her pain with her and just be there and listen, like but we don't need to always fix things, and people can't love us if we're not willing to step up and take chances as well, and so I would say, like, find those 2 or 3 people that you could call at 3 o'clock in the morning and build your community out from them. Like, I don't need 20 best friends.
Yeah.
I just really need 3 people I could call at 2 in the morning, and then and then thrive in community and love people when you get the chance.
It's good. I love it. And how would people find you or connect to what you're doing, whether that's Hope Recovery or other projects?
Yeah, so we have a website, thehoperecovery.com,
Okay.
I think it is, and we're also on Bethel's website. You can find our website on Bethel's general one. And there's information on there of how to be able to contact me personally. I see people in private practice as well. So
Great.
just love to, my motto in life is, if I can change a mom or a dad, I can change a generation.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So
Well, thank you for what you're doing. And it's such a pleasure to be able to talk to you on this level, your experience, insight. I feel like we all need more insight on this issue. Like, it's bigger for me. My life isn't directly impacted by addiction at kind of any level, really. So it's easy for me to just kind of be like, well, nothing's going on. So this has been a good learning journey for me, and to see it so prevalent, like it's actually a big part of our culture. It creates some impetus for, like, okay, let's get in there and be a part of bringing healing, right?
yeah.
So thank you for what you're doing. So again, thehoperecovery.com is how you can find what Laura's doing. They're also on Bethel.com's website. You can search for them there. And you can reach out to Laura through those avenues as well, if you're wanting to sit down with her in a therapeutic setting, or maybe just to ask more questions about what they're building.
Yes.
So thanks so much for your time, Laura. Appreciate you.
Thanks.
Our
Thanks for
friendship.
having me.
You're amazing. Keep up the good work. I'm so glad you're doing what you're doing. And with that, we'll say goodbye. Thanks for joining us, guys. And we'll see you next time. Peace.